That's okay. The Committee on Science, Space, and Technology will come to order. Welcome to today's hearing entitled A Review of the President's Fiscal Year 2015 Budget Request for Science Agencies. I'm going to recognize myself for an opening statement and then the ranking member for her opening statement. The topic of today's hearing is the President's budget request for the coming year. This is the first of several hearings to examine over $40 billion in annual federal research and development spending within the Science Committee's jurisdiction. Unfortunately, this administration's science budget focuses, in my view, too much money, time, and effort on alarmist predictions of climate change. For example, the administration tried to link hurricanes, tornadoes, floods, and droughts to climate change. Yet even the administration's own scientists contradicted the president. The administration also has not been as open and honest with the American people as it should. When the committee asked the EPA for the scientific data being used to justify some of the costliest regulations in history, their response was that they didn't have it, even though they were using it. When we asked the National Science Foundation last year for their justification in funding numerous research grants, the NSF refused to provide a response. All government employees and their agency heads need to remember that they are accountable to the American taxpayer who pays their salary and funds their projects. It is not the government's money, it's the people's money. Further, an estimated $300 million was spent in building the website healthcare.gov prior to its public rollout last October. Secretary Sebelius rightly called this a debacle. In its haste to launch the healthcare.gov website, it appears the Obama administration cut corners that left the site open to hackers and other online criminals. According to experts who testified before the Science Committee, millions of Americans are vulnerable to identity theft from this website. For this reason, the Science Committee has twice asked the White House's Chief Technology Officer, Todd Park, to testify about his role in the development of the healthcare.gov website. Rather than allow him to testify before Congress, the White House instead chose to make Mr. Park available for interviews with Time magazine. So much for accountability and transparency. The administration's willful disregard for public accountability distracts from the important issues of how America can stay ahead of China, Russia, and other countries in the highly competitive race for technological leadership. Perhaps the greatest example of the White House's lack of leadership is with America's space program. The White House's approach has been to raid NASA's budget to fund the administration's environmental agenda. In the last 7 years, NASA's Earth Science Division has grown by over 63%. Meanwhile, the White House budget proposal would cut NASA by almost $200 million in fiscal year 2015 compared to what Congress provided the agency this year. And the White House's proposed asteroid retrieval mission is a mission without a budget, without a destination, and without a launch date. Rather than diminish NASA's space exploration mission, President Obama should set forth a certain near-term, realizable goal for NASA's space exploration. Many experts believe that a Mars flyby mission launched in 2021 is a potentially worthy near-term goal. A human Mars mission would electrify the American public, excite American scientists, and inspire American students. Our leadership has slipped in areas such as space exploration, where we currently rely on Russia to launch our astronauts into space, supercomputing, where China currently has the lead, and even severe weather forecasting, where European weather models routinely predict America's weather better than we can. We need to make up for lost ground. These budget hearings are about something far more important than simply numbers on a ledger. They're about priorities, and the administration should reevaluate its priorities if we want to continue to be a world leader in science, space, and technology. That concludes my opening statement, and the ranking member, the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Johnson, is recognized for hers.
Thank you, Chairman Smith, for holding this hearing, and welcome, Dr. Holdren. It's always good to have you before our committee. The fiscal year 2015 budget request makes it clear that the President remains committed to prioritizing investments in science and innovation. While limited by last year's 2-year budget agreement, the President is proposing to identify new sources for research and development funding, including through much-needed tax reform. This new funding will also make a big difference for some of our top economic development and national security priorities. I welcome discussion on the Opportunity, Growth, and Security Initiative, and I hope that my colleagues across the aisle will do the same before they outright dismiss it. For if we continue to flat fund or cut our investments in science and innovation under the guise of fiscal constraint, our nation will suffer the consequences for many decades to come. Under flat and often uncertain budgets, we are not just ceding leadership in some areas of science and engineering, we are losing the next generation of discoverers and innovators. Early career scientists and engineers, even those in the top of their class, have increasingly come to believe that the nation is unwilling to invest in them and their talents. If nothing changes, we will continue to experience a brain drain that will have profound implications for our country's ability to innovate and compete in global economy. I'll make just a few specific comments about the fiscal year 2015 budget proposal under discussion today. I am pleased with the administration's continued commitment to advance manufacturing, R&D, and workforce development. I hope we can find a path forward in Congress to enact the bipartisan bill that would codify the National Network for Manufacturing Innovation. I also support the increased funding for climate change research and mitigation. Climate change is real, and its consequences are real. Even if some uncertainties remain, it might be easy for the most privileged among us to sit back and say we'll be fine regardless of the severity of the impacts. But the vulnerable among us are already hurting, and scientists and economists predict it will get much worse. I am saddened that we keep debating this at all. I still hope we act before it's too late to direct our nation's great brain power to developing solutions to reduce the warming and mitigate the impacts in our most vulnerable communities. This is also why I'm pleased to see the administration's strong budget proposal for the Department of Energy's Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy, as well as ARPA-E, which will go a long ways toward building and capturing the jobs of a growing sustainable energy sector. At the same time, I have some questions and concerns about the budget proposal, including with respect to other parts of the DOE budget. I'm also disappointed that once again we have a NASA budget request that would cut funding for the nation's human exploration program, even as the Space Launch System and the Orion development projects are building hardware and getting ready for flight tests. In addition, the administration's budget request inexplicably would cut funds for science, one of the most exciting and productive of NASA's enterprises. I also want to learn more about the new scaled-back proposal to overhaul federal investments in STEM education. Now that we have the federal STEM education 5-year strategic plan, I hope we can have a more productive discussion about how the budget proposal is aligned with the goals of the strategic plan and how experts in the stakeholder community are being engaged in major discussions. The truth is, we all have things to be concerned about in this budget, but the root of the problem is that there isn't enough money to go around to adequately fund all of our priorities. The President and the agencies had to make some very tough choices. Some of our own choices may be different, and Congress will have its opportunity to express those choices in our authorization and appropriations bills. But today I look forward to hearing more from Dr. Holden about the President's choices. As we move forward to reauthorize several of the agencies and programs within the committee's jurisdiction, we need to give due consideration to the President's own proposals. Most importantly, I hope that any legislation that we bring to the floor of the House reflect both the needs to invest in our future and our faith in the integrity and potential of our nation's STEM talent. Thank you, Dr. Holden, for being here today, and thank you for your continued contributions to ensuring continued U.S. leadership in science and innovation. I yield back.
Thank you, Mrs. Johnson. And let me welcome Dr. Holdren back to the committee, and we appreciate his being here today. He is our only witness. Dr. Holdren serves as the Director of the Office of Science and Technology Policy at the White House, where he is both the Assistant to the President for Science and Technology and co-chair of the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology. Prior to his current appointment by President Obama, Dr. Holdren was a professor in both the Kennedy School of Government and the Department of Earth Science at Harvard. Previously, he was a member of the faculty at the University of California, Berkeley, where he founded and led a graduate degree program in energy and resources. Dr. Holdren graduated from MIT and Stanford with degrees in aerospace engineering and theoretical plasma physics. Dr. Holdren, welcome, and we look forward to your testimony.
Well, thank you very much, Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Johnson, members of the committee. I'm pleased to be here to discuss the civilian science and technology components of the President's Fiscal Year 2015 budget. I want to start by observing that science and technology as a whole do better in this budget than might be expected, given the stringent caps that apply. Under those caps, we are not able to propose as much for R&D and for STEM education as the challenges and opportunities warrant. But the priority that the President places on these domains is evident in the fact that the 1.2% increase for R&D in his budget over FY14 enacted is 6 times bigger in percentage terms than the 0.2% increase in discretionary spending overall set by Congress in the Bipartisan Budget Act last December. And STEM education in the President's budget is up 3.7% over FY14 enacted. While the base budget in the President's submission for FY15 comports with the caps in the Bipartisan Budget Act, he has also put forward in his submission a vision for stronger investments in America's future in the form of a supplementary $56 billion Opportunity, Growth, and Security Initiative. While requiring additional congressional action, it would be fully paid for by spending reforms and closing tax loopholes, and would come close to restoring FY15 discretionary spending to the level originally planned in the Budget Control Act of 2011. The $56 billion would be divided equally between the defense and non-defense categories, and $5.3 billion of it would support research and development. This would take the $135.4 billion for R&D in the regular budget up to $140.7 billion, which would be a 5.2% increase over fiscal year 14 enacted. And that supplement would include nearly $900 million for NASA. In my written testimony, I described some of the other supplementary R&D investments proposed in the initiative. I just want to mention here a few other points from my written testimony that I think deserve particular emphasis. First of all, within the spending caps, the budget provides for a 1.2% increase in the combined budgets of the National Science Foundation, the Department of Energy's Office of Science, and the National Institute of Standards and Technology Labs to $13.0 billion. These 3 agencies were last authorized in the America Competes Reauthorization Act of 2010. I look forward to working with the Congress on reauthorizing the Competes legislation and its support for these 3 crucially important science agencies. The President's budget for NASA within the spending caps is $17.5 billion. Consistent with the provisions of the NASA Authorization Act agreement between Congress and the administration, the budget funds continued development of the Space Launch System and the Orion Multipurpose Crew Vehicle to enable human exploration missions to new destinations. It funds the continued operation and enhanced use of the International Space Station, which the administration recently announced its commitment to extend through at least 2024. It funds the further development of private sector systems to carry cargo and crew into low Earth orbit, thus reestablishing a cost-effective U.S. capability for these missions and shortening the duration of our sole reliance on Russian launch vehicles for access to the station. It funds a balanced portfolio of space and Earth science, including a continued commitment to new satellites and programs for Earth observation. It funds a dynamic space technology development program, and it funds a strong aeronautics research effort. I look forward to continuing to work with Congress and with this committee on reauthorizing NASA. The budget requests $5.6 million for OSTP, my office, the same as FY14 enacted, to support OSTP's diverse missions in overseeing and coordinating science and technology efforts across the executive branch, including efforts the Congress asked us to undertake in the two Competes Acts, the NASA Authorization Act, and other legislation. As a final point, I want to emphasize the administration's ongoing commitment within the President's Science and Technology budget, not just to R&D, but also to STEM education, to better prepare the next generation of discoverers, inventors, high-skill workers, and science-savvy citizens. As I noted earlier, the budget's $2.9 billion for STEM education programs is a 3.7% increase over FY14 enacted. My written testimony and the STEM education report I delivered to Congress this week update the committee on how the 2015 budget proposal for STEM education differs from last year's. To summarize, the 2015 budget makes important changes that reflect input from the STEM education community and from the committee. This budget continues to reduce fragmentation of STEM education programs across government, but it does not transfer functions and the associated funding between agencies, and it focuses strongly on the 5 key areas identified by the Federal STEM Education 5-year strategic plan released last May. In closing, I look forward to continuing to work with the committee to strengthen the nation's science and technology portfolio and to achieve the economic and other societal benefits it underpins. I'll be happy to try to answer any questions the members may have.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Holder, and I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes for questions. My first one goes to the budget. And in your testimony, you cite 3 agencies, the National Science Foundation, the Department of Energy's Office of Science, and the NIST labs, as having been identified as especially important to the nation's continued scientific and economic leadership. And I agree with you. But the last budget request by President Bush in 2008 was higher in real spending terms for those 3 agencies than President Obama's current budget. And on the screen to our left and right, you will see a chart that shows that at equivalent 2015 dollars, President Bush's fiscal year 2009 Competes request was about $300 million more than that of President Obama. This will surprise a lot of people who may have read otherwise. My question is fairly simple. Why is the administration's budget request, at least in my view, going in the wrong direction?
Well, first of all, I will agree with Ranking Member Johnson in her opening statement that there simply is not enough money to fund all of the administration's priorities. We are suffering through an era of very difficult choices. The essence of the matter, I think, is the President's proposal for the supplementary initiative, the Opportunity, Growth, and Security Initiative, which would boost the funding of NSF by almost $1 billion, boost the funding of NASA by nearly $900 million, boost the funding of NSF by $500 million, and so on. So what we are hoping is that the vision of the President for science and technology, as embodied not just in the base budget, but in the Opportunity, Growth, and Security Initiative, will be welcomed by the Congress and will lead to funding levels that more adequately address the challenges and the opportunities.
And Dr. Holder, as I mentioned in my opening statement, it really comes down to a matter of priorities. And in this instance, as I also emphasized, I think the administration needs to perhaps reevaluate its priorities when we have the Bush administration spending more on those non-defense research and development than the current administration. Let me go to a question about the National Science Foundation. When you testified last year, you agreed that there is room for improvement as to how the National Science Foundation prioritizes grants. On the screen now are 6 NSF-funded studies out of many dozens that, to me, are questionable. You have studying fishing practices around Lake Victoria in Africa, $15,000. $340,000 to study the ecological consequences of early human set fires in New Zealand, a 3-year, $200,000 study of the Bronze Age on the island of Cyprus, surveying lawsuits in Peru from 1600 to 1700, $50,000, the climate change musical that was prepared for Broadway, but I'm not sure ever was actually produced, $700,000, and causes of stress in Bolivia, $20,000. Well, what causes a lot of the stress is studying stress in Bolivia. My question is this. Do you think the National Science Foundation should, in fact, provide the public, it's their taxpayers' dollars that are paying for these, with justification for why the research grants they choose are worthy of funding?
Let me make a couple of comments to that question. First of all, I did say improvement was possible at the NSF with respect to transparency, effectiveness, and so on. I think improvement is possible in virtually every human institution, and I think the NSF has improved in the intervening time. They have issued new guidelines both to their grantees and to their employees about transparency and explanations of the importance and relevance of the research that they fund. These are posted on the NSF website. I am not in a position to address on the fly individual grants.
I understand
I
that.
suggested in the last time I testified here, I'm not sure any of us in this room are as good a judge of the relevance of research projects in social
Dr.
science.
Holden, excuse me for interrupting you, but I want to finish up one more question in a second. But I think my question really went to whether you feel that the National Science Foundation should justify these grants in one way or the other. And I know they, as you say, they've been making some changes. So far, all we've heard is the words. We haven't actually seen these changes implemented yet, and I know you're going to help us with that. But don't you feel that NSF should justify these grants to the American taxpayer?
I believe they do justify the grants to the American taxpayers in what they post on their site about the evaluations. But I would also note that the Organic Act, the National Science Foundation Act of 1950, says that what the foundation is supposed to do starts with promoting the progress of science. And then it goes on to say, to advance the national health, prosperity, and welfare, to secure the national defense, and other purposes. Funding basic research is in the NSF's mission. It is our most important funder of basic research, and we should let it continue to do that.
We're going to have to agree to disagree, perhaps. I do not think that they have justified these grants, at least on what they have publicly posted. And as I mentioned to you earlier, I wrote a letter almost a year ago to the head of the National Science Foundation, and I'm still waiting for justifications on a number of grants, and I think you're going to try to help me get those justifications.
I will try to help.
Okay. Let me yield myself an additional minute, and I don't do that very often, but I'd like to squeeze in one more question. This goes to NASA. In December 2012, the National Academy of Sciences released a report about NASA's strategic direction. That report stated that the committee has seen little evidence that a current stated goal for NASA's human spaceflight program, namely to visit an asteroid by 2025, has been widely accepted as a compelling destination by NASA's own workforce, by the nation as a whole, or by the international community. NASA's own advisory group found the asteroid retrieval mission to be very interesting and entertaining, but it was not considered to be a serious proposal. Combine the asteroid retrieval mission with the Obama administration's track record of canceling space exploration programs, first the Constellation program, then a joint robotic mission to Mars, and now SOFIA, an infrared telescope that flies aboard a Boeing 747. And then add in the administration's proposed budget, which cuts NASA by $186 million, and you have to wonder if the administration is really committed to space exploration. My question is this: as we can see from this chart, the administration's budget request is down 9% in real dollars compared to the last Bush administration, compared to last year of the Bush administration. Is there a good explanation for this?
First of all, Mr. Chairman, the last Bush administration was not laboring under the budget caps that we are laboring under now.
As I said a while ago, it's a matter of priorities.
It is a matter of priorities. There's not enough to go around, and if we get the Opportunity, Growth, and Security Initiative It will enable boosting NASA very substantially.
But meanwhile, the administration doesn't give as great a priority to NASA as it does to a lot of other programs. Obviously, that's the result.
Let me address your comment about the asteroid mission. The quote you mentioned was 2 years old. The asteroid mission has been reformulated and better explained and now has strong buy-in, not only from NASA staff.
They still don't have a budget,
and
they still don't have an asteroid, and they still don't have a launch date. That doesn't sound to me like a very serious program.
There is a budget, there is a target in time for achievement of the mission, and it uses, one of the great attractions of the asteroid mission is it uses capabilities we are already paying for. It will use the SLS. Yeah. It will use the Orion. It will use an electric propulsion.
And other missions would use those same use the same equipment, I think, much sooner. And you have the administration actually cutting SLS and Orion. Again, I don't agree with their priorities.
They are going to stay on schedule. We will have SLS, we will have Orion,
right,
and we will use them for the next
Again, it appears by the cuts that the administration's priorities do not coincide with this committee's priorities. But I thank you for your answers. The gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Johnson, is recognized for her question.
Thank you very much. Dr. Holder, a number of my colleagues continue to question the value of federal investments in social, behavioral, and economic sciences. In the most recent effort among many, the First Act, as introduced, proposed to cut NSF's modest investment in social sciences by 40%. And my colleagues seem unable to connect the dots between human sciences and our national interests. Can you please remind us once again both how small our social science budget is relative to our overall R&D budget, and more importantly, what we lose in terms of benefits to society when we arbitrarily cut and restrict support for competitively awarded social science research? Mike, turn your mic on.
Let me start with the social, behavioral, and economic sciences line within NSF. It, in the FY15 request, is $272 million out of a total research sum of $5.8 billion. So it is a very, very modest proportion of the NSF budget. The second thing I would say is there has been abundant documentation of the benefits to society of NSF's investments in this domain. Those fall in the categories of making our democracy work better, including work on the conduct of elections, management of common property resources without regulation, decision-making under uncertainty, understanding negotiation and compromise, and more. Tracking and improving economic and social well-being, economic and social databases and statistics, understanding poverty, understanding what works in teaching, improving public health and safety, risk communication, what causes people to get out of the way of hurricanes and tornadoes, what works, optimizing disaster response, controlling the spread of infectious diseases through social behavior, reducing human trafficking, understanding the patterns of crime, enabling us to map crime, allocate law enforcement resources better. National defense and international relations, understanding the conduct of other nations, understanding the effectiveness of sanctions. Nonverbal communication, which helps our troops function in environments where other languages are spoken. Interdisciplinary work involving social and economic scientists in cybersecurity, in geographic information systems, in neuroscience, psychology, language learning, decision processes. I think we're getting a lot of bang for the buck out of social, behavioral, and economic sciences in NSF.
Thank you very much. In the First Act, some of my colleagues are proposing to move the Interagency STEM Education Coordinating Committee, known as COSTEM, from the National Science and Technology Council to NSF. COSTEM was created at the NSTC in response to a requirement that we put in the 2010 Competes Act. I have a few concerns about this, including taking resources out of other important NSF programs, and also the decreased stature of the committee if we move it out of the White House. What are your thoughts on moving COSTEM's responsibilities to NSF?
Well, thank you for that question. I think the COSTEM, the Committee on STEM Education, should stay where it is in the National Science and Technology Council. The reason for that is the NSTC is the body that was set up to coordinate and oversee STEM-related activities that cross agency and department boundaries. And of course, as further discussion will doubtless illuminate, and as this committee knows, the STEM education function is spread across many different departments and agencies in this government, harnessing the special capabilities of NASA, of NIH, the Department of Education, the NSF, the Smithsonian Institution. And it is obviously in the interest of coordination and efficiency that the oversight of that operation be in a place that includes all of the stakeholders, all of the participants, as the NSTC COSTEM does.
Thank you very much. Well, I have 15 more seconds. Many of us have concerns about some of the numbers in the President's R&D budget request. For example, the request for NSF is below inflation, but the President is also proposing R&D funding as part of the Opportunity, Growth, and Security Initiative. How does this initiative fit into the President's commitment to continue our investments in science and innovation?
Well, as I said in my testimony, we think the base budget doesn't have enough room for all of the priorities of the President and what we think should be the priorities of the nation. And that's why that supplemental Opportunity, Growth, and Security Initiative was devised, to provide an opportunity for the President to say what he thinks we really need and to provide the Congress an opportunity to provide it.
Thank you very much. I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Johnson. The gentleman from California, Mr. Rohrabacher, is recognized for his questions.
Thank you very much, and Dr. Holdren, thank you very much for being with us today. When we heard the word prioritize a lot here, and in order to prioritize, of course, we have to make sure that judgments are being made and priorities are being made based on accurate information, and especially when we're talking about major energy and environmental decisions that would cost amazing costs to society as well as jobs and reflect the standard of living of our people. The acting assistant administrator of the EPA, Janet McCabe, was here just a short time ago, and I had to ask her a question 5 times before I got an answer, and then she really didn't answer at that point. So I'd kind of like to ask you if I could get an answer to this question from the administration. We keep seeing this being presented to us as a fact, saying that global warming is being caused by human activity, and that 97% of all the scientists believe that global warming is caused by, that there is global warming is caused by human activity. When I'm looking at where they get their information, and as you look very closely at this, you find out that an invitation was sent out to 10,000 Earth scientists. Less than a third responded, and of those, the pool was narrowed down, and this turns out to be 97% of 77 scientists who were selected. And we've even heard this figure repeated here in this chamber and in our debates. Now, let me just ask you out, do you believe that 97% of the scientists believe that global warming is a product of human behavior?
I wouldn't put a lot of stock in a particular number to 2 significant figures. I believe that the vast majority of scientists who are actively working in the domain of climate science take it as the established consensus view that global warming is real, it is happening, it is caused in substantial part by human activities,
so you agree
and it is already doing harm.
Right, but you agree that this is a bogus figure.
No, I wouldn't say it's a bogus figure. I would just say that there are considerable uncertainties around an exact figure. But the fact is, for example, that the National Academies, if I may
finish. I'm asking you a
finish.
direct question. Why can't anybody admit that you've got a group of people putting out a bogus figure here?
This was published in a peer-reviewed article. It was based on generally accepted social science practices for doing polling, where you never get a complete response. I'm not going to defend 97% as accurate to the two significant figures it provides, but I would remind you that every National Academy of Sciences in the world, including all of the National Academies of the G8 plus 5, or what is now the G7 plus 5, have agreed and issued a joint statement that climate change is real, largely caused by humans, dangerous, and we need to take action.
And does the Russian Academy of Scientists agree with that?
Yes.
Then why did the head of the Russian Academy of Scientists tell me just the opposite?
I have no idea about a conversation that you might have had with the president of the Academy. They signed the statement. I can provide it to you for the record.
Well, let me just
happy to do so.
Let me note for the record that I had a meeting with a large number of the scientists in Russia, and the head of the Academy of Scientists said just the opposite to me. Let me ask this about this. Do you believe that tornadoes and hurricanes today are more ferocious and more frequent than they were in the past?
There is no evidence relating to tornadoes, none at all, and I don't know of any spokesman for the administration who has said otherwise. With respect to hurricanes, there is some evidence of an increase in the North Atlantic, although not in other parts of the world. With respect to droughts and floods, which were mentioned in an earlier statement, there is quite strong evidence that in some regions they are being enhanced, if you will, by climate change. Not caused by climate change, but influenced by climate change.
Well, I've noted all of the, and I don't want to sound pejorative, but they're weasel words, I used to call them when I was a journalist, that in some areas, globally, there's not more droughts. Globally, there's not more hurricanes, and they're not more ferocious. Is that correct?
If you want to take a global average, the fact is a warmer world is getting wetter. There's more evaporation, so there's more precipitation. So on a global average, there is unlikely to be more droughts. The question is whether drought-prone regions are suffering increased intensity and duration of droughts, and the answer there is yes.
So we actually have more water and more drought. Okay, thank you very much.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Mr. Rohrabacher. The gentlewoman from California, Ms. Lofgren, is recognized for her questions.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you very much, Dr. Holdren, for being here today and also for your tremendous service to our nation and your leadership in science generally. I am so pleased by the efforts that you've made, and I want to discuss in particular just a couple of things where I hope that we can have a different outcome than in the proposed budget. First, the reduction, Sophia is something that has produced terrific results, and I realize that it's kind of ironic to hear people who were voted for the sequester question the amount of budget available for science. But we do have a tight budget, but to me, it is a problem to reduce when you've spent so much to get the result. And so I won't get into it. I'll just say I do not believe that the Congress is going to accept the elimination of Sophia. There will be a bipartisan effort to change that, and I hope to be and plan to be part of that bipartisan effort. I wanted to raise the issue of the budget for fusion. As you know, last year the National Academies released a report which found that several inertial fusion concepts, including the approaches taken by the National Ignition Facility and the Z-Pulse Power Facility, have enough technical promise to justify dedicated federal support for inertial fusion R&D relevant to energy, not just the weapons reliability. However, there's no program currently in the federal government which directly, officially supports inertial fusion research and technology development activities as it relates to energy production. Now, we discussed this. I know Congressman Swalwell will probably have his own set of questions with the Department of Energy and the new Secretary, but I would like to ask you whether you and the Secretary of Energy have had an opportunity to discuss the National Academy report and whether a collaboration might be in order to actually bring that National Academy suggestion into reality.
Well, let me start by saying, Congresswoman Lofgren, that the 2015 budget does provide $329 million for the continued operation of the National Ignition Facility and the Inertial Confinement Fusion Program at Livermore. And I believe, and I think the Secretary of Energy would probably say the same, that the energy goal at NIF is served by the continuing effort to achieve ignition. The principal challenge with NIF is to get to ignition.
Right.
There have been important steps forward, but we're not there yet, and until NIF can get to ignition, there won't be a basis for figuring out how to turn it into an energy source. And we got $329 million that is going to that facility in continued pursuit of that goal.
If I may, Dr. Holden, and I do appreciate that you have been out there and certainly have boosted morale considerably by your visit to Sandia and Livermore. We have lost hundreds of employees at Lawrence Livermore Lab and 80 scientists, and I was actually out at the lab a few weeks ago, and the attrition rate is about 1.5 scientists a week. And here's my concern, that unless we can give some assurance as to stability, I mean, Livermore is not in my district, but it's an hour's drive from Silicon Valley, and we have competition for these scientists, and they are looking, they're leaving. And so I want to make sure we have the capacity to actually pursue. We've had some tremendous successes in the last few months. Obviously, we don't know, but recently one of the top scientists there said we don't have ignition yet, but we have a lit match. And so we want to make sure that we get this done. And I'll just leave it at that. I wanted to touch on the open access issue. You have just given us the update, which I appreciate so very much. As you know, we had a little disagreement here in the committee, the subcommittee, recently, and I just wanted to thank you for your effort and to make sure that you're aware. We're going to do our best to make sure that does not go off the rails. I think it's essential that when the taxpayers pay for research, that scientists get access to that research, and I wanted to commend your efforts in that regard. And with that, I would yield back.
Yeah. Thank you, Ms. Lofgren. The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Nagelbauer, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Holden, thank you for being here this morning. 2 years ago, in April of 2012, the President signed an executive order announcing the formation of an interagency working group led by the White House to coordinate and plan agency activities for hydraulic fracturing research. I think that was composed of the Department of Energy, EPA, the U.S. Geological Survey, committed to developing this interagency plan. And I think at that time the administration told Congress that they would see the research plan January of last year, and so that would have been January of 2013. That date came and went, and January of 2014 has come and gone. And it's been 2 years, and we haven't seen anything from the report. Dr. Holden, where's the plan?
Congressman, I'll have to get back to you on exactly where the plan is. We certainly have been looking at the issue of fracking, and with an eye to making sure that the very important resource represented by the gas and oil that can be produced in this way continues to be available to the American people by virtue of ensuring that the practices continue to warrant the confidence of the public that this is being done in a way that is not imperiling groundwater, that is not aggravating air pollution, and so on. As to the exact fate of this report, I would propose to get back to you for the record.
Well, I think I'm troubled by a couple of things. One is that there was really not a lot of evidence to really justify, moving down this road. I'm from Texas, and we've been doing hydraulic fracturing in Texas for a very, very long time. And it appears that this administration is on some kind of a witch hunt trying to find some example somewhere, but unfortunately, or fortunately for the industry, is that there's never been any evidence. But then we're going to go spend a bunch of money and promise that we're going to do this study. 2 years come and go. There's no study. Yet the administration still continues to take, in my opinion, a very negative, slanted view towards that technology. And so I have a couple of questions that while you're going to do a little research on there, I'd like to know when we're going to see the report. And
I'll be happy to let you know as soon as I find out when the report will be available. But I want to emphasize this is not a witch hunt. It is not spending much money. But the point is that there is widespread concern in the American public, at least in some parts of the country, that we have to make absolutely sure that this is done safely. I don't want, and the President doesn't want, to lose access to this natural gas and this oil because we've messed it up. And our intention is to maintain access to this economically and, in terms of security, also very important set of resources by making sure that the country does it right.
And while you're doing your research, it'd be interesting to see, how much money has been spent by the various agencies on this, and how much time has been devoted to it. And I guess the other question is when the report is completed, how will it be distributed?
Well, of course, all of these reports that we produce end up being posted on the website of the relevant agency. Many of them end up being posted on the White House website. I will be happy to make sure that you personally get a copy when the report is ready, and I will, again, as I've said, for the record, provide you with an answer on the pace of development of this report, how much money has been spent, and so on.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Nagelbauer. The gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Lipinski, is recognized.
First of all, Dr. Holdren, thank you for your leadership at OSTP and for the administration's commitment to advanced manufacturing. It's a big area of focus for me and something that I believe is a big need for the country in looking to what our future is going to be in terms of economic growth and job creation. Institutes like the recently announced Digital Manufacturing Design and Innovation Institute in Chicago, which utilizes high-performance computing and digital tools to help industries make products better, faster, and more profitably, are vital to reinvigorating our manufacturing base. And I think we should be doing more of those as the administration has been proposing. I'd also like to thank you for your strong support for social science at NSF and the President's budget request. I know that Ranking Member Ms. Johnson had raised this issue, and I just wanted to say that I'm glad to see healthy increases in spending for SBE for next fiscal year in the request, as you had mentioned earlier in answering the question. The first question that I wanted to raise addresses the future of exascale computing. I greatly appreciate the administration's leadership on high-performance computing. In Illinois, we're blessed to have two of the fastest supercomputers in the world, with Mira at Argonne and Blue Waters at the University of Illinois. These two supercomputers make the DMDI Institute possible, make the what's going to be done there in the make Illinois a great place to put that institute. Unfortunately, the rest of the world is catching up to us, and we need to continue making strides towards exascale computing. Could you give your thoughts on the future of federal high-performance computing projects and how the budget helps us push the boundaries towards exascale?
Well, let me start by saying that the Obama administration shares your view of the importance of high-performance computing, which includes but is not limited to getting to the exascale. It also includes capabilities relating to handling very large, very high-velocity flows of data for those high-performance computers to use. It involves advances in software so that the capabilities of these multiple processor machines can be effectively utilized. We are currently engaged in a review of the whole high-performance computing program, which OSTP is leading along with all of the relevant departments and agencies, with an aim toward ensuring that United States capabilities in this domain remain the best in the world. And I would note that although it was pointed out earlier that the fastest computer in the world is currently a Chinese computer, its capabilities, when one takes into account the data handling capabilities and the software performance capabilities, the United States is still in the lead in terms of real capacity of our high-performance computers.
Any idea of when that review is going to be, as you're conducting, is going to be completed? And
I think a matter of months, not weeks, but within a few months.
All right. My next question focuses on STEM education. I recently learned that a new study will be released tomorrow on a Chicago-based STEM teacher professional development program at the Museum of Science and Industry. I'm told the study will confirm the museum's innovative approach increases teacher knowledge and achieves high rates of student growth. 1/3 of Chicago public K-8 schools are involved with this program. I think this is an excellent example of the value that museums and science centers bring to the table, not just for student learning, but for teacher professional development. A lot of museums and science centers like MSI are looking at declining funding from federal programs, particularly with the proposed elimination of the Competitive Education Grant Program at NOAA and the lack of a line item for the program for science museums and planetariums at NASA. The administration reorganization proposal is somewhat changed from last year, including $10 million for the Smithsonian rather than last year's $25 million. Could you give your thoughts on the value of the informal science education that museums and science centers provide, and tell the committee how this new proposal would fund STEM education broadly, but also support these informal types of activities?
Well, to make this relatively brief, the proposal as it has emerged in the FY15 budget does take account of the value of informal education. And that happens not just through what the Smithsonian does, but it happens through what agencies like NASA and NOAA and NIH do in partnership with museums around the country. There are a lot of these partnerships. There are a lot of joint efforts which also involve the Department of Education. I happened to speak with Administrator Bolden, NASA Administrator Bolden, yesterday about NASA's STEM education programs and what they plan to do under the FY15 budget, as well as what they are doing in FY14. And he stressed, as I expect he will in his testimony tomorrow before the Space Subcommittee of this committee, that NASA is working in close collaboration with a number of departments, the Department of Education, and with a number of entities around the country on this continuing use of NASA's extraordinary resources for inspiration and instruction to reach the wider community.
I run out of time. I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Lipinski. The gentleman from Mississippi, Mr. Palazzo, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Holdren, I heard Sophia mention a little while ago, and could you kind of explain for this committee why NASA invested about $1.1 billion and has been working on this project for over 23, 24 years? It just became operationally capable, I believe, 11 days before the President's proposed budget decided to eliminate this project and no longer invest in it, leaving basically our German partners who have been a partner of NASA on this for over 20-something years Can you tell us a little bit about the project and why it was so important 20 years ago, but it's no longer, I guess, relevant to our space program today?
I wouldn't say, first of all, that it's not relevant, but its high operating costs are very difficult to accommodate within the current budget caps. Just to explain to the group what it is, SOFIA stands for Stratospheric Observatory for Infrared Astronomy. It's been a joint project of NASA and the German Aerospace Center. It's an airborne observatory based on a Boeing 747 SP wide-body aircraft. It has a 2.5-meter diameter telescope which accesses the sky through a special door built into the airplane. That telescope has particularly attractive capabilities because the Boeing 747 is flying above most of the water vapor in the atmosphere, which would interfere with the infrared capabilities of the telescope. And it is an attractive project, but it was ranked behind other projects by the decadal survey conducted by the National Academy of Sciences, which we rely on very heavily in making these choices.
Was an internal review done? I mean,
oh, absolutely.
Okay, an external review. You're taking the decadal report.
We're taking the decadal report.
Did you do a senior review, which is, of course, the process of where you have the community come in and actually analyze it for, its benefit to the program?
I would have to defer to Administrator Bolden. You may want to ask him this tomorrow.
Can we see a copy of this? I mean, you said a report was...
I say I will defer to Administrator Bolden. I know the issue was reviewed within NASA. I don't know that there was an external review beyond the decadal survey, which, as I say, ranked it behind other projects that we are continuing.
I understand that, Dr. Holden, but we invested $1.1 billion in this project. Been working on it for over 23, 24 years. It became operationally capable 11 days before the President's budget was announced that it was no longer going to fund this project. So, we have to understand why we've invested American taxpayer dollars in something that apparently was extremely important to NASA, and just at a wave of a wand, it's no longer important. The American taxpayer deserves this. Congress deserves an answer as well. And just real quick, we understand that the Chinese are cultivating, relationships in Europe a lot. They're very aggressively pursuing our European friends. And so when this administration just unilaterally cancels a project with one of our strong European partners, what kind of message does this send to the international community?
It's not a message I relish sending, but again, I would emphasize that there is not enough money to go around, and if the Congress will pass the President's proposed Opportunity, Growth, and Security Initiative, there'll be nearly another $1 billion for NASA, and that SOFIA decision can be revisited.
Well, I agree. We continue to fight over shrinking discretionary pots of money, and until this administration and our colleagues get serious about addressing the number one drivers of our deficits and our debt, we're going to continue to have these issues where we're not going to be able to fund not only just NASA priorities, we're not going to be able to fund our armed forces, and at a time when the world's become a lot more dangerous, not safer, we're skirting our responsibilities. And I hope this President, I hope this his administration and future Congresses will address that serious issue in the future. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Palazzo. The gentlewoman from Maryland, Ms. Edwards, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'd just like to say to my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, I'd be happy to work with them, and I know the members on this side would be, if we are talking about increasing budgets that NASA would have, whether it's for SOFIA or other priorities, so that those priorities meet the needs of the American people. But we haven't seen that kind of cooperation, frankly. Dr. Holdren, I wanted to give you a chance to respond to how some members use the titles, and we've heard it today, of a few National Science Foundation grants to imply that the research that was funded by the grant wasn't necessary or wasn't of national interest. We've heard that this morning, and I think it's fairly easy to imply that research might not be in the national interest by only giving the title. But when you really look into these studies, and I'd urge my colleagues to do that before just reading a title, you realize their importance. For example, some members have questioned grants studying stress in Bolivia. Well, if someone looked into the research and not just the title, what they would find is that this study was investigating a relatively isolated group of people who are remarkably resilient. Understanding a group like that and comparing it to the U.S. population, which is less resilient in some cases, could be helpful to understand the link between behavioral and social factors and diseases like cardiovascular disease that we are seeing in the U.S. population. Other grants that have been mentioned are similar, and once you look into the research, you actually read, you understand its importance. And so I wanted to give you a chance to respond to that, and if you could leave me some time so that I can actually ask you about NASA.
I get the impression some of my answers have been a little long. I apologize. I would just point out that NSF, with the help of encouragement from this committee, has taken steps to make more transparent and accountable their whole process. They have established an internal transparency and accountability working group. They have sent out instructions to all of their staff on standards for transparency and accountability in describing grants, and I think that is already showing up in the detail being provided in the justifications for grants on the NSF website. And I emphasize that that information is available on the NSF website, and people who are interested can take a look and find out whether the justifications for these awards are in fact persuasive. But my own view is that NSF has done a great job with peer review on these grants. Some of the funny sounding titles, as you point out, when you look into them, do make a lot of sense. And I just don't feel that I'm well qualified, or that most people in this room are well qualified to second guess NSF's superb peer review committees. And the one place where improvement has been made is in the transparency of those justifications available to the Congress and available to the public.
Well, thank you very much. And I mean, I'll go to the NSF website, and I'd encourage my colleagues to do the same. Dr. Holdren, I wonder, when we talked about Sophia, and you can get back to the committee about this, and I know that we'll be exploring it even more, it would be helpful to know the process that the administration and that the agency uses in justifying cut to a program or eliminating a program. I think that's always difficult to absorb, because programs aren't just programs. They're jobs, and they're science, and they're investments that have been made. But every once in a while, you do have to kind of, cut, and we understand that. But I would like to know, with respect to Sophia, at some later point as we continue to examine the budget, what the rationale was, what are the steps, the internal processes within the administration to make a determination that Sophia had to go. And if we were to restore Sophia, wouldn't that mean adding another $83 to $85 million into the budget in order to restore that? And I just hope our colleagues understand that that's what the choice is.
Thank you. I will provide more information on Sophia. I would note that NASA is looking at the possibility of other potential partners in the international community to defray those costs, because, again, precisely the problem is there's just not enough money in the current budget to support the operating costs of that mission with just the partnership of the Germans. But if we can expand that partnership, that's one avenue. And another avenue, of course, is finding more money, which the Opportunity, Growth, and Security Initiative would do.
Great. Thank you very much, and I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Edwards. The gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Holgren, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Dr. Holdren, for being here. From our previous discussions, I hope you know that I do appreciate you and appreciate the critical role that the Office of Science and Technology Policy can have in ensuring a competitive future for our children. That being said, it's hard for me to understand the misaligned science priorities this president has put forward in his budget yet again. Whether it's the federal government getting involved with things best handled at the state and local level, or this administration's focus on applied research and subsidies for favored industries that I see as crowding out the basic scientific research needed to bring about the next great technology, invention or cure, this administration does not seem to have its priorities in the proper place. I'm a staunch supporter of STEM education and have been greatly impressed by the student-led robotics teams in my district. Some of them guided me to complete an hour of code, programming a computer game through computer coding. The federal government has been funding STEM education for decades. Every year, a larger emphasis is placed on the subject, and every year we hear how America is falling behind other countries in math and science. Dr. Holdren, do you get the sense that the real problems with America's science education cannot simply be solved with more federal spending? Do you think there are larger societal issues to address that would place more value in spurring our kids to study math and science?
The short answer is, Congressman, that it is a larger societal issue. And one of the things we discover going to other countries, and the President has discovered talking to other heads of state in places where kids do better than our kids on the standardized tests, is they're feeling more pressure from parents to do well in education. We need to get parents more involved in the importance of the education their kids are getting. It's not just a matter of federal spending.
I've seen it really with our robotics teams, the amazing commitment of the parents and mentors being engaged in this as well. There's a raging debate in my home state and across the country about the adoption of the Common Core state standards and whether or not, if they are wise and sufficient to bring up the level of competitiveness of our country that our country is pursuing. I'd like to know what the role OSTP has had in consultation with stakeholder communities, federal agencies, and the states in developing curriculum for Common Core.
OSTP, to my knowledge, has not had a role in that Common Core process. So I would need to look into whether there has been such a role in earlier times.
If you could check, that would be great. You know, these standards are purported to be state-led efforts for Common Core. This was through the action of the states and not coercion by federal government that they adopted these standards. But when I talk to my educators and local officials back in my district, they are only seeing this as a top-down initiative. Now it's getting to the point where our schools are feeling as if they're being coerced into adopting these standards or their funding will get cut off. That kills the ability to collaborate and focus our education system on our kids. I want to switch subjects a bit. I'd like to talk about federal R&D funding, one of my favorite subjects, especially in basic research where government does play a key role. The President has tried to turn science into a political wedge issue, which it is not and should never be. So I'd like to clear up what his budget actually does to science and its precedents. Your budget provides $135.4 billion for federal investment in R&D. Do you know what the previous administration proposed, Dr. Holdren?
Well, it would depend on which year they proposed it. But.
Well, what I saw is $147 billion, which was 20% more funding than we use constant FY 2015 dollars. This certainly does not seem to match with the President's rhetoric, but what I find most alarming are the cuts in basic scientific research. Your proposal has $32.1 billion going to basic research. Is that correct? Okay.
I think that's right. Sorry, I didn't.
When we're talking about budgeting, we are really talking about priorities, and that's really what all this is about. There's limited resources. Families in our district are having to tighten their belts. We have to have priorities here as well. Under President Bush, the request was $32.2 billion in constant dollars, but the basic R&D share was much higher. Under the current proposal, basic research would be at 0.8% of the federal budget. The previous administration had it at 1.1%, significantly higher. I know that you may try to justify these overall cuts by singling out the defense R&D cuts. Non-R&D was still a high priority during the Bush administration. We need to get our priorities right, or we will not continue to have the best research universities and facilities available to our kids moving forward. In our constrained budgetary environment, we need to be sending clear signals to our kids as well as the increasingly international scientific community that science is important to us. The President's budget, I believe, fails to set this message, send this message, and I want to see that change. So my time has expired. I yield back, Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Holmgren. The gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Kennedy, is recognized for his questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Holdren, Dr. Holdren, it's good to see you again. Thank you for being here. Thank you for spending the time. I want to start, Doctor, by going back to an issue that I know you know is important to me and one that we've discussed at length on a number of occasions, and I appreciate your follow-up and your advocacy on these. As you know, STEM education has been an issue that's been very important to me and important to Massachusetts and my district. The area of particular interest to me and what I wanted to push on with you a little bit is middle skill jobs in coordination with community colleges and vocational schools. There's a report from the Brookings Institute came out about a year ago that highlighted facts that I'm sure you're very familiar with, but that 26 million of all jobs, or excuse me, 26 million U.S. jobs, 20% of all jobs require high knowledge in any one STEM field. Half of all of STEM jobs, though, are available to workers without a four-year college degree. Those jobs pay, on average, $53,000 a year, about 10% higher than jobs with similar educational requirements. STEM jobs that require high level of knowledge or high over at least a bachelor's degree are clustered in certain metropolitan areas that we all know: Silicon Valley, Cambridge, Massachusetts, San Jose. But other STEM-based economies require jobs are available for those that require less than a bachelor's degree. There's robust economies in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and Birmingham, Alabama, and Wichita, Kansas as well. And I guess my question for you, Doctor, is through much of the report that I've reviewed, there seems to be an absence of focus on community college, vocational schools, vocational training, technical training. And I wanted to get your thoughts as to, one, where the administration is on this, and two, how we can be helpful and supportive.
We are aware of the gap in high skills worker education short of four-year colleges. Just a couple of months ago, we brought a large number of community college presidents into the White House to discuss what they're doing and how we can be more helpful in what they're doing to link up with manufacturing firms in their regions to create curricula that match training to the jobs that are actually available in those regions. The National Science Foundation's budget in the President's FY15 proposal has something over $60 million for NSF's Advanced Technological Education Program, the ATE program, which centers on education of technicians for high technology fields. So this is something we're working on.
And I appreciate that, Doctor. You visit, or I visited a number of vocational schools and technical training schools in my district. These kids are coming out excited about math, excited about engineering, excited about science, building things that I certainly never built when I was in high school. I still know the quadratic equation. I don't know what good that's doing me. These kids are building things that actually can work, and when their plumbing gets backed up, they can fix it, and I got to call one of them to come fix it. So I guess my point is these are jobs that aren't going to get outsourced. These are jobs that, as studies have shown, have a high earning capacity, and there's jobs that are available today that are going to be available in the future. And I would just ask that the administration continue to focus on this, and if there's ways that we can be helpful on it, we certainly would like to be as well.
Thank you, and we will keep focused on it.
Thank you. And one other issue that I know my time is running short, but I wanted to see if you could comment on. There's been a couple of articles of late, even just in the past couple of weeks, about the prevalence or increasing prevalence of private philanthropy to take over some of or to fill the need, the gap, if you will, from some of these, from the retraction in government funding for basic research. Much of this philanthropy is obviously very well needed, and we should encourage it, and I certainly encourage it. The issue with it is that it is often pinpointed to a specific target by the donor, which is great, and it's their money. They should do what they want with it. But do you see any long-term challenge with relying more and more on private philanthropy to fill the need here, if we're not making as there seems to be broad-based support for this idea that this is one of the essential areas of basic responsibilities of government, yet an unwillingness to make that commitment?
I don't like the idea of calling it reliance on the philanthropic sector. I think we should welcome the engagement of the philanthropic sector in funding research in general and basic research in particular. And there is a new consortium of major private foundations which is working together to try to boost funding for basic research rather than, as you note, targeted research. There is a lot of the latter. We have some very important philanthropic support for the BRAIN initiative that this administration has launched from a number of private foundations, but we are getting support as well for increased philanthropic funding of basic research. But that does not mean that the country can rely on that. It's not going to be big enough. The government needs to continue to meet its fundamental responsibility to support basic research in this country. We would like to be able to support more of it in this budget, and again, we will support more of it in this budget if we get the Opportunity, Growth, and Security Initiative supported by Congress.
Thank you, Doctor. Mr. Chairman, thank you for the extra time.
Thank you, Mr. Kennedy. The gentleman from Florida, Mr. Posey, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Holden, always a pleasure to have you here. I wonder if you could give us a status on the supply, availability, inventory of RU-238 and any other nuclear fuel we may need to travel in space.
My understanding is that there is a new agreement between NASA and the Department of Energy on producing plutonium-238 for our space missions, and I believe that agreement will lead to meeting the needs that we foresee.
How much do we have in stock now?
I would have to get back to you on what's actually in the stockpile at this moment.
Are you aware that they're getting rid of anything that we have in inventory now?
I'm not sure what you mean by getting rid of.
That there may be plans to eliminate part of the inventory that we now have.
I am not aware of any such plans, but I will look into it. This is something I would have to explore with the Department of Energy.
Okay. Do you have a pretty good idea how long it takes to purify this plutonium and how much it costs to do that?
Not off the top of my head. I would expect that in terms of production, we're talking about a time scale of 6 months to a couple of years, I would guess.
And a whole bunch of money. But if you would check on that and seriously get with me and let me know the status of it.
Happy to do that.
We had somebody here from the National Science Foundation, the head actually, who said she wasn't a scientist and so couldn't answer any questions. And I was just curious. I asked her how many ice ages she thought that this Earth had been through. I mean, everything I can gather, minimum of 3, maximum some say from 5 to 7. But I just wonder how many ice ages you think we've gone through.
Well, again, I don't remember off the top of my head. I think the numbers you mentioned are in the ballpark, but I would have to look at the record. The Earth has undergone climate changes throughout its entire history. The difference is that for most of that history, there weren't 7 billion people on the planet who needed to be fed, clothed, and kept prosperous. And the other difference is that the pace of change was generally much slower.
I'm running out of time. I'm aware of that. Obviously, we've had global warming for a long time. You can't have one seamless ice age that encompasses 3 ice ages. We had to have warming periods between each one of those. And so that is a natural phenomenon. And just because we're alive now, the tectonic plate shifts aren't going to stop. The hurricanes and tsunamis aren't going to stop. The asteroid strikes aren't going to stop. These things have gone on for eons, and they're going to continue to go on for eons. What do you think the temperature was on Earth before the disappearance of the dinosaurs?
There have been periods when the temperature was 3, 4, 5 degrees Celsius warmer than it is now. And the difference between the circumstances you're describing and the circumstance we're in now is the changes that are being imposed on the climate in substantial part as a result of human activity are faster than the ability of ecosystems to adapt, and maybe even more importantly, faster than the ability of human society to adapt. There are a lot of stresses, as you point out, that we can't control. But the stresses we can control that are imposing burdens on our society, we ought to think about controlling.
No doubt about that. And I don't think there's anyone, I haven't heard anyone say ever from either side of the spectrum that there's no such thing as climate change. I mean, We've had climate change since the day the Earth was formed, whenever that was, depending upon whatever you believe. And we'll have climate change to the day the Earth implodes, whenever that is. The question is, how much of the climate change do you think is influenced by human behavior?
The climate change we are experiencing now, the climate change we've been experiencing for the last several decades, is, according to the Academies of Science, according to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, according to the view of most of the scientists who work on this, largely due to human activities. We are superimposing on slow, natural climate change a rapid human-induced climate change.
But as a percentage, like let's say that you anticipate that climate would change X amount in a year without the existence of humans on it. How much more do you think, as a percentage of the change, is influenced by human behavior?
The natural changes which we understand, and which are underway on a long-term basis as we speak, would, if they were the only influences, be cooling the planet rather than warming it. We would be in a long-term cooling trend as a result of the natural forces affecting climate that we understand. We are instead in a warming trend, which suggests that human activity is overwhelmingly responsible for the difference. We would be having cooling based on natural forces. We are having warming.
I remember in the 70s that was a threat. We're going to have a cooling that's going to eventually freeze the planet, and that was the fear. That was before Gore invented the internet, or the other terms. I'd read that during the period of the dinosaurs, the Earth's temperature was 30 degrees warmer. Does that seem fathomable to you?
30 degrees sounds like a stretch to me, but I will review the literature and get back to you.
Thank you, Dr. Holdren, very much. I yield back, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Posey. The gentleman from Washington, Mr. Kilmer, is recognized for his questions.
He's not. Mr. Kilmer's not. Mr. Kilmer's not here. So.
Dr. Barra.
Dr. Barra for his question. The gentleman from California.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you, Dr. Holdren, for being here. Obviously, we're in a very competitive global environment. We're in a very competitive global economy, and that's not going to change in the near future. The one area that we do have a very competitive advantage over the rest of the world is in innovation. And clearly, we're still the most innovative country in the world. We're still the most innovative economy in the world. But we also recognize that we're starting to lose that advantage by not making the necessary investments to continue to move things forward. We also recognize that many of my colleagues have touched on the importance of training scientists and engineers to continue that economic advantage. Recently I had a town hall at Intel with Intel has a major presence in my district, and had the chance to meet with their leadership to talk about their future investments, but also talk about their challenges. And clearly one of the challenges that their leadership brought up was the lack of availability of engineers, and also the lack of availability of folks that know how to write code. We've also in this committee have had a hearing on that as well, and as we had the folks from code.org testify. There's two things that really jump out at my mind. One, they said it can't happen at the college level. If we actually want to start our kids on coding and teach them those skills, it has to happen at the elementary school level. And Dr. Holdren, I'd be curious about your comments within the President's budget and within the STEM budget. If we truly want to have our kids not just learn reading, writing, and arithmetic, but also have them learn the language of the future, which increasingly appears to be coding, are there initiatives both to put that into part of the Common Core, as well as one of the challenges that repeatedly comes up is the lack of educators who actually know how to teach that coding as well, and if there's funding to train the trainers or train the teachers?
I would make a couple of comments on that. One, there is certainly funding in the President's budget for recruiting, preparing, and supporting more outstanding teachers in STEM fields, which would include teachers who know how to code and who know how to teach coding. There's $40 million in the budget to support the goal of preparing 100,000 excellent STEM teachers over the next decade. There's $20 million to launch a pilot STEM Master Teacher Corps. In addition, I would note that we have a problem with inadequate exploitation of the talent pool. Women are drastically underrepresented in engineering and in computer science. African Americans and Hispanics are drastically underrepresented in these fields, and we have a series of programs aimed at improving inclusion, opportunities for girls and women in STEM fields, opportunities for other underrepresented groups, including minorities. We've had a lot of effort on that front just in the last couple months in connection with Black History Month and then Women's History Month, and tapping a larger fraction of the nation's talent pool for these purposes is going to be a very important part of the solution.
Dr. Holdren, I'm glad that you brought that up. I think the statistic that was quoted to me last week was it's less than 20% of all our engineers are women at this juncture, the ones that are graduating. If you were to recommend to, again, I think this committee has a desire to train those folks to fill those future jobs, what recommendations would you have for us as a body in getting more girls to think about engineering futures and careers, as well as some of the minority groups that are certainly underrepresented?
Well, this will seem very self-serving, but I would hope that the committee will support the President's budget in this domain because it has a lot of focus on those issues.
Great. Last question in my remaining time. The other area that I've focused on certainly is as research budgets get tighter and so forth. One area that, coming out of a background in higher education as an associate dean in a public university, research funding is becoming increasingly tight. And we've talked a little bit about what we can do to enhance technology transfer and so forth. Do you have any recommendations that are both within the President's budget to allow the private sector to come in at an earlier phase?
Well, the President has been a strong advocate from the outset of his administration of strengthening partnerships between the private sector, the academic sector, and including the national laboratories in that. The National Network for Manufacturing Innovation is a good example of that. The energy hubs that the DOE has set up are great examples of that. They're bringing private sector enterprises together with folks from research universities and national labs to build partnerships to grease the tracks, if you will, between discovery in the laboratory and a productive application in society. And we want to continue to do that, and there's substantial support for that in the President's FY15 budget.
Well, fabulous. We look forward to supporting those investments.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Bear. The gentleman from New York, Mr. Collins, is recognized.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wasn't attempting to go down this road, Dr. Holdren, but you've stated really twice today that SOFIA would be a priority under OGSI with increased funding, certainly implying very directly that SOFIA is an administration priority. I'd like to direct your attention to statements by NASA that actually brags about cutting SOFIA's budget to fund other programs, and I have here a letter and a document from OGSI that specifically states how they would spend the extra money, the $187 million. SOFIA is not listed there twice, so I'd like to ask you very directly why you have left this committee with the impression, very direct impression, that SOFIA is a priority of the administration where clearly it is not.
What I have said is SOFIA was ranked behind several other.
Okay, so what you're admitting is it's not a priority.
But
is it or is it not a priority?
In better funding
I'm asking
times,
you a direct question, sir.
In better funding times,
please
we would
answer the
support
question, sir?
SOFIA.
Is it a priority?
It is a lower priority than the things that we are funding.
Thank you, sir, because you have implied differently today, and I don't appreciate the implication. It's hypocritical and disingenuous to leave this committee with the impression SOFIA was a priority, and it is clearly not. So my next line of questions concerns security on healthcare.gov. I chair the subcommittee on healthcare and technology and small business. We've had folks here on both sides of the aisle testify. Healthcare.gov was not secure when it was launched, is not secure today. And we've been attempting to get Mr. Todd Park to testify in front of this committee on 3 occasions. The administration has refused to make him available. And yet clearly, Mr. Todd Park has had involvement in healthcare.gov, and certainly with his background and his position now as an advisor to the President, would and should have been involved with the security issues. So, I guess, I can read all the times Mr. Park has been involved, his involvement with CMS, his involvement with various meetings, his attendance at all these meetings, and just have to ask you once again, in light of all the information and all the meetings and all the involvement of Mr. Park, how can your office state, which they've done just again recently with a letter to Chairman Smith, that none of your personnel have been involved with healthcare.gov? Pretty bold statement.
We have not said that none of our personnel have been involved with healthcare.gov. Mr. Park, in particular, was asked by the President after the problems with healthcare.gov materialized after its rollout. He was asked to become heavily involved. He has been very heavily involved in trying to address the problems of the website since that time.
So you've never said there's no involvement prior to launch?
We said his involvement has not been primarily associated with the security of the site. He is not a cybersecurity expert, and the responsibility for the security of the site rested with CMS and with the interacting activities of CRS, the IRS, and the Social Security Administration.
So you're suggesting that he was blindsided by the problems in this, had no knowledge of as the advisor to the President, and all of a sudden when all the problems, including experts who've said this website should never have been launched. It was not secure the day it was launched. It's not secure today. Americans' privacy is in danger. Their identity theft is real. And so you're saying that this, Mr. Park, and that's why we want him to testify here. So let me just cut to the chase. Why won't you allow him to testify?
It has been the practice of this administration from the beginning that assistants to the President who are not Senate confirmed do not testify. We have other people who are experts in cybersecurity who are willing to testify before this committee on cybersecurity issues. Mr. Park is not an expert in the cybersecurity aspects of the healthcare.gov website, and he is a direct report to the President of the United States. I can't compel him to come and testify. He doesn't report to me. I'm not sure what else you want for an answer.
Well, much like Sophia, I'd like a more direct answer, not a dance like you've been dancing today. And the fact is the experts have testified that the website was not secure the day it was launched. It is not secure today, and yet your office and others within your office are now just claiming ignorance. You had no idea this was coming. You woke up one day, oh my goodness, it's not secure. I think you, again today, I've been very disappointed in your testimony. Disingenuous, not direct, and I think deliberately misleading to this committee. And with that, Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Collins. The gentlewoman from Connecticut, Ms. Esty, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Dr. Holdren, for your many decades of service to this country and your willingness to serve in this challenging time. I wanted to briefly touch on three topics. First, STEM education, which I think you have now gathered is an extremely high priority of this committee. Secondly, the regional innovation initiatives, and third, climate change resiliency. I'm very glad to hear that you mentioned the importance of including and reaching out to young women and to children of color. We cannot be competitive in the 21st century, globally competitive, if we are leaving 60% of our workforce out of the STEM fields. So if you can elaborate on that aspect of how exactly you plan to do that, I would also recommend to you and ask you how you are reaching out to local stakeholders. I come from Connecticut. We have local companies like Stanley Black & Decker who are partnering with places like the Connecticut Science Center, as well as our local community colleges like Naugatuck Valley Community Colleges. They are working together with our local manufacturers to try to design some of these programs. I brought astronauts into the inner city to meet with middle school students to inspire them about the opportunities that are available. Can you talk a little bit with us about what efforts going forward the administration is going to utilize to engage these local stakeholders to make sure that our programs actually will work on the ground?
Sure. Let me mention a couple of elements of the FY15 budget proposal that address those issues. One is the STEM innovation networks. There's $110 million to help school districts individually and in consortia build partnerships. STEM innovation networks that would be partnerships with businesses, universities, museums, federal science agencies, and other entities to basically transform STEM teaching and learning, and I would add inspiration, by developing coordinated plans to do that in the STEM fields. There is $150 million in the budget in a program to redesign high schools to teach real-world skills, basically relating to the earlier point that Congressman Kennedy was making as well, to rethink the high school experience, challenging schools to scale up innovative models that provide rigorous and relevant education, including for folks who are not going to go on to college but are going to go into high skills careers. The network of manufacturing innovation institutes will also be obviously a regionally focused set of efforts to link up schools, universities, national labs, businesses to the ends that you're discussing.
That's a perfect point to segue to the regional innovation centers. I'm strongly supportive of the efforts to expand those centers. I think they are going to be critically important to have the sort of innovation and linkage we need from basic research in our high-tech research universities, places like UConn, whose medical center is in my district, Yale, which is right nearby, with our local communities, community colleges, high schools, elementary schools as well, and our manufacturers. So strongly supportive of efforts to expand those efforts. And right. One thing I would like to flag that we've learned, since this is a real passion of mine and very important in my district, is going to be really important to engage the private sector in providing internship possibilities for students. And this goes back to the inner cities in part, and to girls. They need to have the opportunity to work and see in environments where they're actually doing this during the summer, in a workplace setting where they understand the soft side skills as well as the culture, and that is critically important to inspire them and encourage them to pursue these fields, which are often very tough. So just want to make a plug for that. Coming from the Northeast, living through this extremely challenging last couple of years, I'd like quickly, with the time I have remaining, your thoughts about the climate change resiliency theme in the budget through NOAA and EPA, about the development of a climate change resilience toolkit and web portal, and how will improved access for this data help protect our communities on the impacts of climate change. And it seems more focused on attention to understanding and mitigating regional impacts. And can you sort of describe the reason to take that approach?
Okay, very quickly, before I answer the last question, I do want to mention that the America Competes Act in 2010 authorized a number of Department of Commerce programs focused on regional innovation. And the President has proposed those. The Congress has funded them. They've created a variety of regional innovation clusters and partnerships of the sorts I described. So I think that's something we remain committed to in partnership with the Congress. We just rolled out last week the first tranche of the Climate Data Initiative, which is one of the elements of the President's Climate Action Plan. That Climate Data Initiative is being led by NOAA and NASA, but has participation from a wide variety of other departments and agencies. The aim of it is to provide data that is transparent and informative and rigorous, that local and regional decision makers, communities, businesses, farmers, fishermen, individual citizens can use to better anticipate what climate change will be doing in their regions or their localities, and to be better able to take steps to prepare for it and to minimize the damages that result from it. The first focus of the Climate Data Initiative is on sea level rise and coastal flooding. The next phase will be looking at agriculture. The phase after that, I think, will be looking at impacts on health. It will be followed by a resilience toolkit that provides a variety of applications which will make it easier for people to make use of these data, understanding what they mean and applying them to their local needs. Climate change obviously is a problem that is global in its origins and in its dynamics, but its effects are local. And that's why the focus of the Climate Data Initiative and the whole resilience and preparedness approach is local and regional, because climate change is not uniform, and people in different regions and localities need to be prepared for what is going to happen there.
Thank you, and I appreciate your indulgence, Mr. Chairman, in letting him finish the answer to that question. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Esty. The gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Schweikert, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Professor, I got to tell you, out of all the positions in government, you actually, I think, may have one of the most interesting jobs. But you also have a interesting effect on what the future, long after you and I are probably gone, will have. I'll do my best here to sort of have a linear thought in these questions. In your discussions with the administration, and first one I'm going to ask you about is the ICANN decision recently. I'm a great believer that sort of egalitarian access, the crowdsourcing of information and data being available is crucially important. And it's also sort of the ultimate vetting of what's out there in science. Has there been any discussion of protocols of what would be done to make sure that if we've given up dominance of sort of internet policy, that dominance won't be taken by whether it be the UN, where the majority of member states are not, free democracies? How do we make sure that the world has sort of an open, free speech environment on the internet?
There has, of course, been discussion of that. It is a focus of ours. We are certainly not giving up influence, and it's not our intention to allow the internet to go in a direction that imperils
one of my real concerns here is, as Americans, we're all free speech advocates, but I believe the head administrator of ICANN now has often spoke that he'd like a UN body. Well, you and I know the majority of member states in the UN aren't anywhere near where we are culturally in the protection of free exchange of speech. And so it's a real concern. Has this at least hit a high level of discussion?
It has. We are concerned about it, too, and we are determined to hold the line.
Why would we have made the statement that we're going to walk away from sort of our managerial control until that sort of underlying agreement was designed?
This is not my field of expertise, and I'm not sufficiently familiar with the arguments that were gone through. I know they were intensive. As in many other domains, this is an area where globalization has been going on, and it's sometimes difficult to retain a position of absolute dominance over time when that's happening. But I would be happy to get back to you with more information.
As you know, for many of us who are, free speech advocates, we always have a concern that we're paying for NSA sin in perception. So just where that may be. Science advisory body. The advice, the information that's often given to agencies that are asking for direction and modeling. This committee is dominant in the statute that actually creates. What do you think your obligations are, or the advisory board or body's obligation is to respond to our inquiries? Because my fear is there's advice being given to agencies, then we say, tell us, will you share with us the direction you're going there, and we get stonewalled.
Well, I'm not sure what in particular you're referring to. My office, the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, is of course responsible for providing, above all, science and technology advice to the President and his other senior advisors.
But I testify, like IRTA.
I testify regularly before Congress, and our reports, which embody the bulk of our advice, are available on our website.
But no, we've already had several occasions on this committee where we've reached out to, is it IRTA, and said, share with us the advice you're giving to certain agencies, and we don't get it back. And let me sort of do a hop skip, and I'll even follow up with this one in writing. Congressman Nagebauer was asking a question about within the budget line, the study of hydraulic fracturing, horizontal drilling, correct? And within that, part of his question he was trying to ask is, you've designed budget line items, but yet you apparently haven't actually designed what the study is going to look like.
Oh, the study is underway.
Then when we've asked for how are you doing your sample sets, are you reviewing the literature, are you sending people out to do actual, hard samples, how come we're having trouble getting that information delivered to us?
I had not been aware that you were having trouble, but if you direct that inquiry to me, I will provide you with answers.
So could you at least commit to myself, or more importantly, the chairman, could we have the design plan? I have a fixation on baseline data sampling because I believe it often ends up, we often talk about the modeling, but you and I know your first sin is always or your first cornerstone is in how you choose to collect the data. So if you would be willing to provide us the plan on how the study is built, and obviously that would be reflected in the budget request, that would go a long way for confidence in this committee.
Good, I'll try to do that.
Last two things, and I know I'm way over time. There is some compliment out there, but I also think we need to make sure our friends on both sides understand some of the groups you oversee have protocols on blinding personal data. We do it in the census. We do it in medical research. And so there is sort of a national standard for doing that. I do a sample set. I have individual personal data. If that data is going to be made public, you have a way of doing placeholders, correct? So because we had sort of a bizarre conversation in this committee about 6 weeks ago where there seemed to be a misunderstanding that it's standard protocol on how to blind individual data. Last thing, who in your organization sort of watches peer review publications? Because I now have a binder on my desk in my office now of articles where we're realizing how much, I'm uncomfortable using the word fraud, but how many outliers we're finding where really bad data is being used in peer review studies, publications, grants, and how do we fix that? And I'm a believer that, the crowd putting things out on the internet and having lots of voices talk about it will help us find where we're funding studies that the underlying data sets either were grossly misinterpreted or actually outright fraud.
This is a really important issue. We devoted a public session of the last meeting of the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology to it. We invited the editors-in-chief of both Nature and Science, the two most important science journals in the world, plus a number of experts on data and the presentation of data and the kinds of pitfalls that occur within my organization. The Associate Director for Science, currently awaiting confirmation, is the person who has the most direct oversight of that set of issues. But we are concerned about it. We are interested in it.
Professor,
and we will look at it.
I'm elated to hear that hits because, as you know, so often we will base public policy and spending and then later find out there was something horribly wrong in that model or the underlying samples or just outright fraud to get the grant. Can I beg of you, send me a note, send me something in writing who I should reach out to, because I actually have a powerful interest in this because of my concern that resources may be going askew because of bad acts.
I'd be happy to respond.
I know I'm way over time. Thank you for your patience, Mr.
Thank
Chairman.
you, Mr. Schweikert. The gentlewoman from Oregon, Ms. Bonamici, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Holdren, welcome back. Thank you so much for your testimony and for your work. I want to start by saying I'm glad to see the administration acknowledge the importance of the Manufacturing Extension Partnership Program. I've met with several companies in Oregon who have benefited from the MEP program, so through NIST, thank you very much. I'm also encouraged to see the administration focusing resources on innovative energy projects at ARPA-E, specifically the potential of battery technology. I recently spoke with someone from a utility in Oregon, Portland General Electric, and they recently installed a 5-megawatt lithium-ion battery, a battery-powered energy storage facility. It happens to be on top of the Kettle Brands facility rooftop, so we can think about that whenever we're eating kettle chips. So that's in Salem, Oregon, and it's partially funded by the Department of Energy's Pacific Northwest Smart Grid Demonstration Project. But they've learned an immense amount about how efficient battery technology can help the grid integrate renewable energy resources. So more R&D in battery technology I see as a win-win. Really a common goal, and what we've been talking about throughout this hearing and all the disciplines is how we keep our country competitive, how do we have an innovative workforce. I want to mention the Innovation Corps program within NSF to commercialize university research, which you mentioned in your testimony. I was wondering how that program will be structured, and I encourage you to look at the Oregon ONAMI, Oregon Nanoscience and Microtechnologies Institute. They're doing great work with commercialization of material science and systems technology. I want to follow up on the STEM education discussion as well. You referenced the 21st Century Community Learning Centers, a way to bring STEM education outside the traditional school day. I recently met with students at the Forest Grove, Oregon High School who are part of the 4-H Tech Wizards after-school program. That's a great opportunity for students to engage outside of the school day. And on that note, we've had some great discussion already. Dr. Barron, Representative Kennedy, and Representative Hultgren mentioned the FIRST robotics program. Hands-on learning is so important. And I wanted to follow up on that. You may recall I'm the co-chair of the bipartisan STEAM caucus, integrating arts and design broadly defined into STEM learning. There's plenty of research to show that educating and exercising the right brain helps to educate creative and innovative students who become innovators and entrepreneurs. And simply put, we want people who can not just answer questions, but also know what questions to ask. So you talked about the updates to the STEM reorganization plan for the fiscal year budget. And on the Hill, we've witnessed a growing consensus about how do we expand STEM education. You mentioned reaching out to underrepresented populations. So can you expand on whether that plan acknowledges the benefit of including alternative approaches to STEM education?
Well, first of all, I commend your interest in the STEAM approach and the progress being made with it. I think it is important to remember the relevance of the humanities and the arts as we think about our education portfolio overall. And I think some of the kinds of activities that are in the various programs listed under STEM undoubtedly are including these other dimensions as well. I think many of the outreach and the community-based programs are doing that. So basically I can only agree with your comments.
Well, thank you. The more we learn about the parallels between science and art, and the last time I asked this question, I mentioned a study that was done about the number of Nobel laureates in sciences who also engage in arts and crafts is phenomenal, and they recommend that students studying in the STEM disciplines also have arts and crafts experience. It really is hands-on learning, but again leads to that creativity and innovation that we want in our workforce. And could you follow up a little bit about the Innovation Corps and how that program will be structured through NSF to help commercialize research?
Well, that is a program that's already been going on in NSF, and my understanding is that it is already successful in basically including in a number of the activities that NSF funds training on how to be an entrepreneur, how to translate discoveries in the laboratory into practical applications that can become the basis of businesses and social good. So I think it's a great program. I think it's working, and we should continue to support it.
Thank you very much. My time has expired. I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ms. Bonamici. Appreciate that. The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Weber, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome, Dr. Holman. Appreciate you being back again. I don't remember if it was Mark Twain or Will Rogers or Ambrose Bierce or something like that that said all scientists are only sure about one thing, and that's that all scientists before them were wrong. Have you ever heard that comment?
I've heard versions of it.
Okay. Well, who was it that said that? No idea. So when you guys do your research, you start with a scientific, what do they call it, postulate or theory, and you work from that direction forward. Is that right?
It depends on what sort of science that you're talking about, but the notion of posing a hypothesis and then trying to determine whether it's right is one of the tried and true approaches in science, yes.
So I'm just wondering how that related to, like, for example, global warming and eventually global cooling. And I may want to get your cell phone number, because if we do go through a couple cycles, global warming and then back to global cooling, I need to know when to buy my long coat on sale. You know, so I just don't know how you all proved those hypotheses going back 50, 100, you know, what you might say is thousands or if not even millions of years, and then how you postulate those forward. But we'll get into that in a little bit. The Keystone Pipeline, I'm very, very interested in, because it comes into my district, delivers 840,000 barrels of oil a day. It'll help get us off oil from the Middle East or Venezuela and produce jobs over here. The State Department actually came out with a finding and said, here's one of those scientific, hopefully, findings, I guess, that, quote, the approval or denial of any one crude oil transport project, including the proposed project, is unlikely to significantly impact the rate of extraction in the oil sands or the continued demand for heavy crude oil at refineries in the United States, end quote. Do you agree with that statement from the State Department?
Well, I would say, number one, I have not done a review at this point of the State Department's analysis of that, and not having looked at the analysis, I don't want to say whether I agree with it or not.
Okay. Well,
it is a respectable position. There are others.
So they're from the government. They're here to help. So looking at your budget as you've put it forward and the different areas, there's one, like Congressman Nagelbauer said, on fracking, where that study has never been done. Do you know if there's any plans in Texas? One of my other colleagues, maybe it was Congressman Nagelbauer, referred to the fact that we've been doing fracking since 1945, which, if my high school math holds up, would be 65 years. Do y'all ever think about perhaps getting with the agencies in Texas that actually have that experience and that deal with that every day? And in fact, Texas, we would say we've been doing it longer than anybody else. Any plans to get with the TCEQ and those that have experience?
I suspect that outreach has happened as part of the study.
Could that help your budget? Would that help your budget numbers go down because you could rely on their experience?
I suspect the budget numbers take into account the fact that we have been reaching out to the constituencies that do this.
Okay. Do you think that it's possible that if we had more manufacturing jobs based on this energy renaissance that we are about to experience, if the government will get out of the way, that if we had more manufacturing jobs, that we could take more Americans off of the unemployment rolls and welfare, so to speak, and that we could get actually more taxpayers on the rolls, and then we could actually have more money for the budget to do the very thing you want to do, which would be research, more research, and to put more money into an all-of-the-above energy program. Does that make sense to you?
Absolutely, it makes sense. And the administration is all in favor of increasing the number of manufacturing jobs, and we've been trying to do that in a number of ways.
Well, they keep saying that, but looking at the energy renaissance and their war on the coal plants, and I don't think that's deniable, war on coal plants and war on fossil fuels, and the dragging of the Keystone Pipeline permit, which has been now 5 years. Do you have any plans? Do you weigh in with the president? Do you say, Mr. President, and from our vantage point, if you would approve the permit, as the State Department said, using the State Department's language, it was an amendment I got on a bill through the House, taking the permitting process away from the president. Do you have any? Can you say to the president, Mr. President, the State Department is saying it's a go? What's the holdup?
As I understand it, the ball on that issue is still in the State Department's court. That was an analysis. The Secretary of State has not made a national interest determination at this point, and so we're awaiting that.
But you're the scientist. You have the budget. You're putting together the budget. You want more research. You want more money to do these kinds of things, and if we can get more taxpayers, we can increase that budget, right?
Absolutely. As I've said, we are in favor of increasing manufacturing jobs in this country, and it would bring many benefits.
Well, I hope when you leave here, you'll call the president and tell him you and I had this conversation. I'm recommending approval of the Keystone Pipeline. Thank you, Dr. Holden.
Thank you, Mr. Weber. The gentleman from California, Mr. Swalwell, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Dr. Holdren. And Dr. Holdren, I have to say I'm disappointed that many of my colleagues across the aisle have used this hearing titled Key Issues for the President's Fiscal Year 2015 Research and Development Budget to relitigate whether climate change is happening and whether it's man-made. And at this rate, frankly, I have to say you should be prepared to address whether the Earth is round or flat. That might come up. Or whether, indeed, gravity is happening. You never know what could fly at you from what we've seen already. And I have to say that with 97% of the scientists stating, and as you pointed out, that is an approximation based on statistics, that climate change is man-made, I am encouraged to see that some of my colleagues across the aisle have been a voice for the minority 3% scientists today. This is encouraging for other minorities that my colleagues across the aisle have not helped out, including immigrants who are waiting for comprehensive immigration reform, minorities like women who have not received equal pay for equal work, minorities who are affected by the Voting Rights Act where action has not taken, as well as gay and lesbian minorities who have been oppressed by some of the policies that my colleagues across the aisle have put in place. So the colleagues who are standing up for the 3% scientists who do not believe in climate change, I'm encouraged that they are now a voice for the minority. But you are here to discuss the President's Fiscal Year 2015 budget, and I have a question first about the National Ignition Facility, which is in my district in Livermore, California. And I want to know, in light of the recent alpha heating phenomenon that occurred there, do you still believe that fusion project is near the goal line and that ignition is near achievement, and what that means for future rounds of funding?
Well, first of all, I applaud the advances that have been made at NIF over the past year. I think they are important. I think it's still quite some distance from the finish line when you look at the energetics every step of the way. There's considerably more progress that needs to be made before we can say we actually have ignition, and there would be more progress beyond that would be needed to convert that achievement into a workable fusion reactor. But the project is well worth pursuing. The $329 million in the budget for pursuing it should enable a good deal of further progress, and I look forward to seeing that.
I also wanted to talk a little bit about the inertial fusion research that is in the budget, and particularly that the National Ignition Facility and the Z-Pulse Power Facility have enough technical promise to justify dedicated federal support for inertial fusion R&D relevant to energy, not just weapons reliability, as Ms. Lofgren pointed out. However, there is currently no program in the federal government which directly officially supports inertial fusion research and technology development's activity for energy production purposes. Rather, the administration is proposing to eliminate all of the activities in the Fusion Energy Sciences program that could make important contributions to fusion research, including an experiment at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory that is only beginning to operate this year. So my question is, do you believe that the department should address the findings of this National Academy's report, which found that these concepts have technical promise, and at least find a way to allow strong, merit-reviewed proposals for inertial fusion energy research to be eligible for federal support?
Let me make a couple of quick comments. We, of course, are aware of the National Academy's report. We recognize the progress that's been made in inertial confinement fusion in a number of different ways, with the lasers, with pulse power, with ion beams. Those approaches, of course, have not yet demonstrated the level of performance that would be needed to convert them into an energy source. They are, in fact, still well short of the performance of the magnetic confinement approach, which is being pursued in parallel. Under the budget restraints we face, we think the most important thing to continue funding in the inertial confinement space is the NIF and its progression toward ignition. The experiment you mentioned at the Lawrence Berkeley Lab is a small one, completed at a cost of about $11 million. It began operating 2 years ago, but it's fallen far short of its design specifications, and so it's hard to keep it near the top of the priority list given the tight budget and the performance shortfalls in that particular device.
Thank you, Dr. Holdren. Thank you for your service to our country, for your belief in science, and for now knowing what to be better prepared to discuss next time you come back, including whether gravity is really occurring and whether our Earth is flat or round. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Swalwell. Dr. Holdren, thank you for your testimony today. We appreciate that very much. Our record will stay open for a couple of weeks in case members have additional questions to submit. And with that, we stand adjourned.
Competes legislation and its support for these three crucially important science agencies. The President's budget for NASA within the spending caps is $17.5 billion. Consistent with the provisions of the NASA Authorization Act agreement between Congress and the administration, the budget funds continued development of the Space Launch System and the Orion Multipurpose Crew Vehicle to enable human exploration missions to new destinations. It funds the continued operation and enhanced use of the International Space Station, which the administration recently announced its commitment to extend through at least 2024. It funds the further development of private sector systems to carry cargo and crew into low Earth orbit, thus reestablishing a cost-effective U.S. capability for these missions and shortening the duration of our sole reliance on Russian launch vehicles for access to the station. It funds a balanced portfolio of space and Earth science, including a continued commitment to new satellites and programs for Earth observation. It funds a dynamic space technology development program, and it funds a strong aeronautics research effort. I look forward to continuing to work with Congress and with this committee on reauthorizing NASA. The budget requests $5.6 million for OSTP, my office, the same as FY14 enacted, to support OSTP's diverse missions in overseeing and coordinating science and technology efforts across the executive branch, including efforts the Congress asked us to undertake in the two Competes Acts, the NASA Authorization Act, and other legislation. As a final point, I want to emphasize the administration's ongoing commitment within the President's Science and Technology budget, not just to R&D, but also to STEM education, to better prepare the next generation of discoverers, inventors, high-skill workers, and science-savvy citizens. As I noted earlier, the budget's $2.9 billion for STEM education programs is a 3.7% increase over FY14 enacted. My written testimony and the STEM education report I delivered to Congress this week update the committee on how the 2015 budget proposal for STEM education differs from last year's. To summarize, the 2015 budget makes important changes that reflect input from the STEM education community and from the committee. This budget continues to reduce fragmentation of STEM education programs across government, but it does not transfer functions and the associated funding between agencies, and it focuses strongly on the 5 key areas identified by the Federal STEM Education 5-year strategic plan released last May. In closing, I look forward to continuing to work with the committee to strengthen the nation's science and technology portfolio and to achieve the economic and other societal benefits it underpins. I'll be happy to try to answer any questions the members may have.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Holdren. I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes for questions. My first one goes to the budget. And in your testimony, you cite 3 agencies, the National Science Foundation, the Department of Energy's Office of Science, and the NIST labs, as having been identified as especially important to the nation.
For the most privileged among us to sit back and say we'll be fine regardless of the severity of the impacts. But the vulnerable among us are already hurting, and scientists and economists predict it will get much worse. I am saddened that we keep debating this at all. I still hope we act before it's too late to direct our nation's great brain power to developing solutions to reduce the warming and mitigate the impacts in our most vulnerable communities. This is also why I'm pleased to see the administration's strong budget proposal for the Department of Energy's Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy. as well as ARPA-E, which will go a long ways toward building and capturing the jobs of a growing sustainable energy sector. At the same time, I have some questions and concerns about the budget proposal, including with respect to other parts of the DOE budget. I'm also disappointed that once again we have a NASA budget request that would cut funding for the nation's human exploration program, even as the Space Launch System and the Orion development projects are building hardware and getting ready for flight tests. In addition, the administration's budget request inexplicably would cut funds for science, one of the most exciting and productive of NASA's enterprises. I also want to learn more about the new scaled-back proposal to overhaul federal investments in STEM education. Now that we have the federal STEM education 5-year strategic plan, I hope we can have a more productive discussion about how the budget proposal is aligned with the goals of the strategic plan and how experts in the stakeholder community are being engaged in major discussions. The truth is, we all have things to be concerned about in this budget, but the root of the problem is that there isn't enough money to go around to adequately fund all of our priorities. The President and the agencies had to make some very tough choices. Some of our own choices may be different, and Congress will have its opportunity to express those choices in our authorization and appropriations bills. But today I look forward to hearing more from Dr. Holden about the President's choices. As we move forward to reauthorize several of the agencies and programs within the committee's jurisdiction, we need to give due consideration to the President's own proposals. Most importantly, I hope that any legislation that we bring to the floor of the House reflect both the needs to invest in our future and our faith in the integrity and potential of our nation's STEM talent. Thank you, Dr. Holden, for being here today, and thank you for your continued contributions to ensuring continued U.S. leadership in science and innovation. I yield back.
Thank you, Mrs. Johnson. And let me welcome Dr. Holdren back to the committee, and we appreciate his being here today. He is our only witness. Dr. Holdren serves as the Director of the Office of Science and Technology Policy at the White House, where he is both near-term realizable goal for NASA space exploration. Many experts believe that a Mars flyby mission launched in 2021 is a potentially worthy near-term goal. A human Mars mission would electrify the American public, excite American scientists, and inspire American students. Our leadership has slipped in areas such as space exploration, where we currently rely on Russia to launch our astronauts into space, supercomputing, where China currently has the lead, and even severe weather forecasting, where European weather models routinely predict America's weather better than we can. We need to make up for lost ground. These budget hearings are about something far more important than simply numbers on a ledger. They're about priorities, and the administration should reevaluate its priorities if we want to continue to be a world leader in science, space, and technology. That concludes my opening statement, and the ranking member, the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Johnson, is recognized for hers.
Thank you, Chairman Smith, for holding this hearing, and welcome, Dr. Holdren. It's always good to have you before our committee. The fiscal year 2015 budget request makes it clear that the President remains committed to prioritizing investments in science and innovation. While limited by last year's 2-year budget agreement, the President is proposing to identify new sources for research and development funding, including through much-needed tax reform. This new funding will also make a big difference for some of our top economic development and national security priorities. I welcome discussion on the Opportunity, Growth, and Security Initiative, and I hope that my colleagues across the aisle will do the same before they outright dismiss it. For if we continue to flat fund or cut our investments in science and innovation under the guise of fiscal constraint, our nation will suffer the consequences for many decades to come. Under flat and often uncertain budgets, We are not just ceding leadership in some areas of science and engineering. We are losing the next generation of discoverers and innovators. Early career scientists and engineers, even those in the top of their class, have increasingly come to believe that the nation is unwilling to invest in them and their talents. If nothing changes, we will continue to experience a brain drain that will have profound implications for our country's ability to innovate and compete in global economy. I'll make just a few specific comments about the fiscal year 2015 budget proposal under discussion today. I am pleased with the administration's continued commitment to advance manufacturing, R&D, and workforce development. I hope we can find a path forward in Congress to enact a bipartisan bill that would codify the National Network for Manufacturing Innovation. I also support the increased funding for climate change research and mitigation. Climate change is real, and its consequences are real. Even if some uncertainties remain, it might be easy.
The Assistant to the President for Science and Technology and co-chair of the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology. Prior to his current appointment by President Obama, Dr. Holdren was a professor in both the Kennedy School of Government and the Department of Earth Science at Harvard. Previously, he was a member of the faculty at the University of California, Berkeley, where he founded and led a graduate degree program in energy and resources. Dr. Holdren graduated from MIT and Stanford with degrees in aerospace engineering and theoretical plasma physics. Dr. Holdren, welcome, and we look forward to your testimony.
Well, thank you very much, Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Johnson, members of the committee. I'm pleased to be here to discuss the civilian science and technology components of the President's fiscal year 2015 budget. I want to start by observing that science and technology as a whole do better in this budget than might be expected, given the stringent caps that apply. Under those caps, we are not able to propose as much for R&D and for STEM education as the challenges and opportunities warrant. But the priority that the President places on these domains is evident in the fact that the 1.2% increase for R&D in his budget over FY14 enacted is 6 times bigger in percentage terms than the 0.2% increase in discretionary spending overall set by Congress in the Bipartisan Budget Act last December. And STEM education in the President's budget is up 3.7% over FY14 enacted. While the base budget in the President's submission for FY15 comports with the caps in the Bipartisan Budget Act, he has also put forward in his submission a vision for stronger investments in America's future in the form of a supplementary $56 billion Opportunity, Growth, and Security Initiative. While requiring additional congressional action, it would be fully paid for by spending reforms and closing tax loopholes, and would come close to restoring FY15 discretionary spending to the level originally planned in the Budget Control Act of 2011. The $56 billion would be divided equally between the defense and non-defense categories, and $5.3 billion of it would support research and development. This would take the $135.4 billion for R&D in the regular budget up to $140.7 billion, which would be a 5.2% increase over fiscal year 14 enacted. And that supplement would include nearly $900 million for NASA. In my written testimony, I described some of the other supplementary R&D investments proposed in the initiative. I just want to mention here a few other points from my written testimony that I think deserve particular emphasis. First of all, within the spending caps, the budget provides for a 1.2% increase in the combined budgets of the National Science Foundation, the Department of Energy's Office of Science, and the National Institute of Standards and Technology Labs to $13.0 billion. These 3 agencies were last authorized in the America Competes Reauthorization Act of 2010. I look forward to working with the Congress on reauthorizing the...
That's okay. The Committee on Science, Space, and Technology will come to order. Welcome to today's hearing entitled A Review of the President's Fiscal Year 2015 Budget Request for Science Agencies. I'm going to recognize myself for an opening statement and then the ranking member for her opening statement. The topic of today's hearing is the President's budget request for the coming year. This is the first of several hearings to examine over $40 billion in annual federal research and development spending within the Science Committee's jurisdiction. Unfortunately, this administration's science budget focuses, in my view, too much money, time, and effort on alarmist predictions of climate change. For example, the administration tried to link hurricanes, tornadoes, floods, and droughts to climate change. Yet even the administration's own scientists contradicted the president. The administration also has not been as open and honest with the American people as it should. When the committee asked the EPA for the scientific data being used to justify some of the costliest regulations in history, their response was that they didn't have it, even though they were using it. When we asked the National Science Foundation last year for their justification in funding numerous research grants, the NSF refused to provide a response. All government employees and their agency heads need to remember that they are accountable to the American taxpayer who pays their salary and funds their projects. It is not the government's money, it's the people's money. Further, an estimated $300 million was spent in building the website healthcare.gov prior to its public rollout last October. Secretary Sebelius rightly called this a debacle. In its haste to launch the healthcare.gov website, it appears the Obama administration cut corners that left the site open to hackers and other online criminals. According to experts who testified before the Science Committee, millions of Americans are vulnerable to identity theft from this website. For this reason, the Science Committee has twice asked the White House's Chief Technology Officer, Todd Park, to testify about his role in the development of the healthcare.gov website. Rather than allow him to testify before Congress, the White House instead chose to make Mr. Park available for interviews with Time magazine. So much for accountability and transparency. The administration's willful disregard for public accountability distracts from the important issues of how America can stay ahead of China, Russia, and other countries in the highly competitive race for technological leadership. Perhaps the greatest example of the White House's lack of leadership is with America's space program. The White House's approach has been to raid NASA's budget to fund the administration's environmental agenda. In the last 7 years, NASA's Earth Science Division has grown by over 63%. Meanwhile, the White House budget proposal would cut NASA by almost $200 million in fiscal year 2015 compared to what Congress provided the agency this year. And the White House's proposed asteroid retrieval mission is a mission without a budget, without a destination, and without a launch date. Rather than diminish NASA's space exploration mission, President Obama should set forth a certain